The metallic clank of the tow chain echoed through the cemetery air as I stood frozen in my black suit. I could not believe what was happening. My father's funeral service had just ended, and now here I was, watching my car being dragged away from the church parking lot. Tears of grief mixed with rising anger as I spotted her across the street, Sheriff Sheila, sitting in her cruiser, a cold smile playing on her lips as she scribbled something in her notepad. "There must be some mistake," I called out, my voice breaking. "My father just died. Everyone is parked here." The tow operator would not look me in the eyes. "Sheriff's orders," he mumbled, handing me a citation with trembling hands. "Only yours, sir." The whispers from the funeral attendees grew louder behind me. My mother stood in shock at the church steps, watching her son being humiliated on the worst day of her life. That was when I realized the truth. This was not about parking violations. This was Sheriff Sheila's final insult to my father's memory, and it would be her biggest mistake. I returned to Millfield after 15 years away, not for a high school reunion or holiday celebration, but to bury the man who had given this town everything. My father, Thomas Mitchell, had been the history teacher at Millfield High for 37 years. He coached baseball, ran the debate team, and volunteered at the community center every weekend. His heart attack came without warning, massive and merciless, leaving a void in the community that gathered to honor him. The church was filled beyond capacity that Thursday morning. People stood along the walls and spilled onto the steps outside. Former students, colleagues, neighbors, all there to pay respects to a man who had shaped their lives with quiet dignity. I sat in the front row, my mother's fragile hand gripped tightly in mine. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as the Reverend spoke of my father's dedication to the town and its children. "Thomas Mitchell believed in this community," the Reverend said, his voice carrying through the hushed sanctuary. "He believed in lifting others up, in standing for what was right, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult." During the eulogy, I glanced around at the sea of faces. Many were streaked with tears. My father had been loved, truly loved. I had parked my rental car along the curb outside, as had many others. The small church lot had filled quickly, and the police had always made exceptions for funeral services. It was an unspoken courtesy in our small town, or so I had believed. After the final hymn, I helped carry my father's casket down the church steps. The weight of it felt appropriate, heavy, final, yet somehow dignified. We loaded it into the hearse for the short procession to the cemetery. People began filing out, preparing to follow. My mother needed her medication from the car before we continued to the graveside service. "I will get it for you," I told her, gently guiding her to rest on a bench beneath the church's old maple tree. "Wait here." I walked around the corner to where I had parked, straightening my tie and wiping my eyes. But my car was not there. Confused, I looked up and down the street. Several vehicles remained parked exactly as mine had been. But my rental, a black sedan, was gone. "Are you James Mitchell?" A man in overalls approached, clipboard in hand. "Yes," I answered, disoriented by his presence. "Your vehicle has been towed for illegal parking in a funeral loading zone." He thrust a yellow citation into my hand. "What? This is my father's funeral," I replied, my voice rising with disbelief. "Everyone is parked here." The tow operator shifted uncomfortably. "I am just following orders, sir." Sheriff Sheila radioed it inspecifically. That was when I noticed her police cruiser across the street. Sheriff Sheila Grayson sat inside, sunglasses hiding her eyes, writing something with deliberate slowness. She did not acknowledge me, though she surely saw me standing there in my funeral suit, citation in hand, confusion and humiliation washing over me. Mourners began to gather around me, witnessing my distress. An elderly woman placed her hand on my shoulder. "Oh, James, I am so sorry. This is outrageous." My mother appeared at my side, her grief momentarily overshadowed by concern. "What happened? Where is the car?" How could I tell her? How could I explain that in the midst of laying her husband to rest, we were being subjected to this petty display of power? The whispers spread through the crowd. People exchanged knowing glances. "Let me drive you both," offered Mr. Peterson, my father's colleague of 30 years. "We can deal with this later." As we walked toward his car, I looked back. Sheriff Sheila had finally emerged from her cruiser. She stood tall in her pressed uniform, watching us. And then she did something I will never forget. She smiled. A small, satisfied smile that told me everything I needed to know. This was not about parking violations or town ordinances. This was personal. That day, Sheriff Sheila did not just take my car. She trampled on my grief. She disrespected my father's memory and humiliated me in front of my childhood community. As Mr. Peterson drove us to the cemetery, I made a silent promise to my father. That smile, that cold, calculated smile, would be the last line Sheriff Sheila would cross without consequence. The impound lot sat on the outskirts of town, a fenced graveyard of vehicles behind a small, prefabricated office. After the burial, after the hands had been shaken and condolences received, after I had held my mother as she collapsed against me at the lowering of the casket, I found myself standing before a bored attendant who barely looked up from his magazine. "Retrieval fee is $200, plus the citation. Cash or card," he stated flatly, sliding a form across the scratched counter. I examined the citation more closely now. "Illegal parking during restricted event," it read. The violation code referenced Town Ordinance 22.14b. The signature at the bottom was a practiced scrawl, S. Grayson. "What exactly is a restricted event?" I questioned, maintaining my composure despite the anger simmering beneath. The attendant shrugged. "Funeral loading zone. Says the church requested exclusive access." "It was my father's funeral," I replied, my voice steady but strained. "Thomas Mitchell, I am his son." For the first time the man looked up, discomfort flashing across his features. "Oh, well, I just processed the paperwork, sir." "Were any other vehicles towed from the church today?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He checked his computer. "No, sir, just yours." He paused, then added quietly, "Black Lincoln, right? Only one from that location." I paid the fee and signed where indicated. The injustice of it burned, but I needed the car to drive my mother home. She was waiting with a family friend, exhausted beyond words from the most terrible day of her life. As the attendant processed my payment, the door opened behind me. James Mitchell." I turned to find Deputy Carl Watson removing his hat. We had been classmates, though never friends. Time had added weight to his frame and lines to his face, but I recognized him immediately. "Carl," I acknowledged with a nod. He glanced at the attendant, then motioned me outside. In the shadow of the building, he spoke in hushed tones. "Listen, I wanted to say I am sorry about your dad. He was a good man, taught me more than I probably deserved to learn." "Thank you," I replied automatically, the polite response ingrained after a day of similar condolences. Carl looked over his shoulder before continuing. "And I am sorry about your car. That should not have happened." "Then why did it?" I asked directly. He sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. "Off the record, Sheila, Sheriff Grayson, she did not like your family, especially your father." Why?" "Your dad was on the school board when she was denied that teaching position years back, before she joined the force. And then there was that time he spoke against her at the town council when she wanted to put cameras in the high school hallways. Carl shook his head. Sheila does not forget. She does not forgive. Said your dad made her look small in front of people. The revelation settled like a stone in my stomach. So she waited until his funeral to get even. That is beyond petty. That is sick. Look, I cannot be involved in this. I have a family to support. Carl replaced his hat. But what happened today was wrong. Your dad deserved better. With that, he walked to his cruiser and drove away. Later that afternoon, I stood at the counter of the sheriff's office, filing an official complaint. The deputy taking the report barely concealed her amusement. When I mentioned the selective enforcement, she simply replied, "Sheriff has discretionary authority on all traffic and parking violations." As I turned to leave, frustrated and increasingly angry, an elderly man stopped me outside. I recognized him as Mr. Holloway, the former town librarian. "I overheard what happened," he said, his voice quavering slightly. "You are not the first, you know. Last year, during Mrs. Cornwall's funeral, her daughter's car was towed. And before that, the Henderson boy, right during his mother's service." "She targets funerals?" I asked, incredulous. Mr. Holloway nodded solemnly. "Only certain ones, people who crossed her somehow, or their families." He touched my arm lightly. "Your father was too good for this town, James. Too good and too honest. Some people cannot stand in the light of honest men without seeing their own shadows grow longer." I drove back to my childhood home in silence, knuckles white against the steering wheel. The house was now filled with casseroles and sympathy cards. My mother had finally fallen asleep, sedated by grief and medication. I sat at my father's desk, staring at the citation in my hand. It was personal, petty, calculated, a quiet vengeance against a man who had already been buried. I thought of Sheriff Sheila's smile as she watched me standing helpless outside the church. The humiliation, the disrespect, not just to me but to every person who had gathered to honor my father. I clenched the steering wheel on the drive back and I realized something. She had declared a war I never asked for, but I would finish it. For my father. For every person she had bullied with her badge. This was no longer about a towed car. This was about justice. The attic of my childhood home had always been my father's domain, an organized archive of our family history, meticulously cataloged and preserved. In the days following the funeral, as my mother rested and visitors brought endless dishes of comfort food, I found myself drawn to this space. The pull was instinctual, as if my father's presence might linger among his possessions. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light that streamed through the small window. Cardboard boxes lined the wooden shelves, each labeled in my father's precise handwriting. Family photos, tax records, correspondence, school materials, each container a chapter of his ordered life. What exactly am I looking for? I wondered aloud, trailing my fingers across the box lids. Then I spotted it, a filing cabinet in the corner that seemed newer than the rest of the attic furnishings. It was locked, but the key hung on a nail beside it. Inside were folders, dozens of them. Each contained newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, emails printed and annotated in my father's careful script, all concerning the town administration, and many, far too many, about Sheriff Sheila Grayson. One folder was labeled simply Parking Ordinances, Selective Enforcement. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor and began to read. My father had documented instances dating back 7 years. Notes from townspeople who had come to him with complaints about unfair targeting. A pattern emerged, small punishments against those who had spoken against Sheila's policies or questioned her authority. Parking tickets outside town meetings for vocal critics. towing from temporary no parking zones that appeared without notice, citations issued to some while identical violations by others were ignored. There were photographs, statements, dates and times meticulously recorded, but most surprising of all, none of it had ever been filed. My father, the man who taught generations to stand up for what was right, had collected evidence but never used it. A yellowed newspaper clipping caught my eye. My father at a town council meeting speaking at the podium. The caption read, "Teacher challenges sheriff's proposal for expanded powers." In the background of the photograph, visible but blurred, was Sheila Grayson. Even in that grainy image, her expression was unmistakable, pure, undiluted hatred. Buried among the papers was a half-written letter addressed to the state attorney general's office. My father had begun building a case but never sent it. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before his death. I reached for my phone and called Margaret Willis, the former city clerk who had retired last year. She had been a friend of my parents for decades. "James," she answered warmly, "how are you holding up, dear?" "I am in Dad's attic," I replied, skipping pleasantries, looking through his files on Sheriff Grayson. The silence that followed spoke volumes. "So you knew," I said finally. Margaret sighed heavily. "Your father was concerned. He had been for years, but he believed in working through proper channels, in building an airtight case before making accusations." "Did he tell you about the parking enforcement, the targeting?" "Not just parking," Margaret revealed. "Sheila has been using every minor regulation in the town code to punish people who cross her. Your father documented it all after the Anderson boy was arrested for loitering. He was just waiting outside the library for his mother to pick him up after your father's history club." "Why did he never come forward?" I asked, struggling to understand. "He was going to," Margaret said softly. "He was preparing everything for a formal complaint to the State Oversight Board. Said he needed to make sure it was perfect, that no one could dismiss it as a personal grudge." I ran my hand over another folder labeled "Funeral Violations." Inside were statements from 2 families. Both had experienced the same thing I had, vehicles towed during services for loved ones. Both had connections to people who had opposed Sheila in some way. "Did you know about the funerals?" I asked, my voice tight with renewed anger. "Yes," Margaret admitted. "She calls them discretionary violations. Uses a town ordinance about funeral procession routes that was meant to protect mourners, not punish them." After hanging up, I spread the files across the attic floor. A pattern larger than I had imagined began to take shape. This was not just about my father or our family. This was systematic abuse of power spanning years, affecting dozens, perhaps hundreds of citizens. That evening, I drove to the home of Richard Gale, a former deputy who had retired 3 years earlier. He had been my basketball coach in middle school, and my father had mentioned him often as one of the good ones. Richard invited me in, offered condolences, and listened without interruption as I explained what I had found. "Your father came to me once," he admitted when I finished. "Wanted to know if what she was doing was normal procedure. I told him flat out it was not, but proving malicious intent, that is another matter entirely." "He was building a case," I said, "and I intend to finish it." Richard studied me for a long moment. "Be careful, James. Sheila has eyes everywhere, and she does not fight fair." I nodded, understanding the warning for what it was. As I stood to leave, Richard placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Your father never wanted conflict," he said. "He always looked for the best in people. But sometimes," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes good men need to finish what bullies start." When I returned home, I cleared space in my father's study and began constructing a case file of my own. I created digital scans of every document, organized statements chronologically, mapped incidents across town to show patterns of targeting. What had begun as grief was transforming into purpose. I was not just honoring my father's memory, I was defending it. And somewhere in town, behind her badge and authority, Sheriff Sheila remained unaware that her greatest mistake had not been targeting my father or towing my car. It had been underestimating how thoroughly a teacher's son would do his homework. These municipal codes are designed to confuse the average citizen, explained Catherine Chen over video call. My college roommate had become a municipal attorney in Chicago, specializing in administrative oversight. Her face on my laptop screen was serious as she reviewed the documents I had sent. But once you understand the framework, you can use it against them. For the past 3 days, I had been living amid stacks of town ordinances, legal precedents, and enforcement guidelines. My father's dining room table had disappeared beneath the sprawl of my investigation. Catherine had agreed to help navigate the legal labyrinth I now found myself in. Look at Ordinance 22.14b, the one Sheila cited for your car, Catherine pointed out. It requires clear public notification no less than 24 hours before enforcement. Were there signs posted, public notices? None, I confirmed. And I have statements from 5 other attendees confirming no notifications were visible. Catherine nodded, making notes. That is violation number 1. Then there is the reasonable discretion clause in Section 3 of the sheriff's enforcement powers. It requires written justification for selective enforcement, meaning if some cars were towed and others were not, there must be a documented reason why. And that documentation would be public record. Absolutely. File an open records request for all towing authorizations signed by Sheila over the past 5 years. Request supporting documentation for selective enforcement decisions. If she has been doing this systematically, there will be gaps, inconsistencies, missing paperwork. I worked through the night, drafting a formal records request that was precise, comprehensive, and impossible to dismiss. Catherine reviewed it before I filed it with the county clerk's office the next morning. The clerk, a young woman who had been one of my father's final students before retirement, glanced at the name on the request form and then up at me. "Mr. Mitchell," she said softly, "I am very sorry about your father." "Thank you, Jessica," I replied, recognizing her from photographs in my father's study. "He spoke highly of you." She looked around to ensure we were alone, then leaned forward slightly. "There has been a lot of activity around here lately. New parking ordinances being rushed through. Sheriff Grayson has been in and out all week submitting enforcement updates." "What kind of updates?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "Retroactive documentation for past towing incidents, amended reports, things that should have been filed contemporaneously but suddenly need administrative correction." Jessica's expression conveyed her suspicion. "Just thought you should know." That afternoon, I met with David Mercer, a data analyst who had grown up next door to us. We sat in a quiet corner of the town library, surrounded by books my father had likely touched countless times during his tenure at the high school. "I can cross-reference the data once we get it," David assured me. "Look for patterns, anomalies, statistical unlikelihoods." "What do you think we will find?" I asked. David adjusted his glasses. "Based on what you have told me, I expect to see towing incidents clustered around specific events, town meetings, protests, memorial services. And I expect those incidents to correlate with individuals who have challenged the sheriff's authority or policies." "Can you prove it mathematically?" If the pattern exists, David replied with quiet confidence, I can quantify it. While waiting for the record's response, I continued gathering testimonials. Former students of my father, business owners, elderly residents. Each had a story about Sheriff Sheila's selective enforcement, small indignities and petty punishments that had accumulated over years into a climate of quiet fear. Mr. Hernandez, who owned the local hardware store, described how his delivery truck had been ticketed daily after he spoke against the sheriff's proposal for increased department funding. Mrs. Johnson, the choir director, had found her car booted after questioning the necessity of police presence at school functions. Individual incidents that seemed minor in isolation, but together formed a mosaic of abuse. 5 days after filing my request, Jessica called. The records are ready for pickup, she informed me. All 5 years' worth, and James, there is a lot, more than I expected. The records filled 3 bankers' boxes. I loaded them into my car under the watchful eye of a deputy who had, coincidentally, parked across from the county building. As I drove away, I noticed a patrol car pull out behind me, following at a distance. That evening, new parking restriction signs appeared on my mother's street. No overnight parking, violators will be towed. The signs were dated as if they had been approved months ago, though neighbors confirmed they had been installed that afternoon. I installed security cameras around my mother's property that night. 4 high-definition units with cloud backup and motion detection. If Sheila wanted to escalate, she would do so on record. The following day, Catherine and I began analyzing the towing records. The pattern was even clearer than we had anticipated. A significant spike in towing incidents during civic events, where contentious issues were being discussed. Selective enforcement that disproportionately affected individuals who had spoken against Sheila's policies or questioned her authority. This is not just a violation of procedure, Catherine stated after reviewing the data. This is a systematic abuse of power, and now we have the documentation to prove it. Law had always seemed like a maze to me, complex, confusing, designed to favor those who created it. But with the right map, it could become a weapon. And as I organized the evidence before me, I realized that Sheila had made a critical mistake. She had used paperwork as a shield for years, hiding behind regulations and ordinances. But paper leaves trails, and I was following hers directly to the truth. The knock came at 8 in the morning, sharp and official. My mother, still in her robe, peered through the curtains before turning to me with concern etched on her face. "It is the sheriff's department," she whispered. I guided her gently away from the door. "Let me handle this." 2 deputies stood on the porch, hands resting casually near their belts. I recognized neither of them, which was unusual in our small town. New hires, perhaps, or specifically selected for this task. "Good morning, officers," I greeted them calmly. "How can I help you?" The taller one consulted a clipboard. "We are conducting a routine zoning inspection. There have been reports of code violations on this property." "What kind of violations?" I asked, maintaining a neutral tone despite the transparent harassment. "Unregistered vehicles, improper waste disposal, potential structural hazards." He recited the list without meeting my eyes. "We need to inspect the premises and garage." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me to shield my mother from this intrusion. "Do you have a warrant?" The deputies exchanged glances. "This is a regulatory inspection, sir. We do not require a warrant for visible violations." "Then you can observe from the sidewalk," I replied firmly. "If you see something that concerns you, you can request a proper warrant." The second deputy finally spoke. Mr. Mitchell, Sheriff Grayson would prefer to resolve this informally. No need for things to get complicated. The threat hung in the air, barely veiled. I felt something shift inside me, not fear but a cold, focused clarity. Please inform Sheriff Grayson that I prefer things on the record from now on. All communication, all inspections, all enforcement actions, properly documented and legally executed. I maintained eye contact with each of them in turn. My father taught civics for almost 4 decades. I learned a few things about procedural rights. They retreated to their vehicle but remained parked outside for nearly an hour. When they finally left, they placed a yellow notice on our mailbox, a warning for an unregistered garage vehicle. They were referring to my father's restored 1967 Mustang, which had been covered and stored in the garage for years, a project he had worked on every weekend, a passion he had intended to complete in retirement. That afternoon, I received a call from Elaine Murphy, who owned the flower shop downtown. She had provided the arrangements for my father's funeral at a significant discount, her way of honoring a man who had taught her children. "James, I do not want to worry you," she began, her voice quavering slightly. "But I thought you should know. I have been fined for improper commercial use of public sidewalk. $300. They say my flower displays extend too far from the storefront." "When did this happen?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "This morning. Sheriff Sheila came herself, said she was conducting a business district compliance sweep. But James," Elaine's voice dropped to a whisper, "she only came to my shop, and I have had those displays in the same spot for 15 years. The message was clear. Anyone who helped me would face consequences. Sheila was tightening her grip, sending warnings through proxies and punishments, creating a circle of isolation around my investigation. Later that day, I visited the town coffee shop and overheard 2 elderly women discussing recent events in hushed tones. "First the Mitchell funeral, now Elaine's shop. Who will be next?" one whispered. "SHH, Margaret, you know how it is these days. Walls have ears," the other cautioned, glancing nervously toward the door. The fear was palpable, a current running beneath the surface of everyday interaction, people making eye contact, then quickly looking away when they saw me, conversations halting when I approached, a community bound not by trust but by shared anxiety. That evening, I installed the final security camera at my mother's home. Each entrance, the driveway, the street view, all monitored continuously, footage backed up to secure cloud storage. If Sheila or her deputies returned, every action would be recorded, every word documented. "Is all this really necessary?" my mother asked, watching me adjust the angle of a camera mounted near the kitchen window. I thought of Sheila's smile at the funeral, the tow truck, the deputies on our porch, Elaine's fine, the fear in the coffee shop. "Yes," I answered simply, "it is." My mother touched my arm gently. "Your father always said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. But James, be careful. Some people prefer the shadows and they do not leave them willingly." That night, I recorded a video statement detailing everything that had happened since the funeral. I described the towing incident, the subsequent harassment, the pattern of targeting that extended beyond our family. I stored copies in multiple locations, with instructions for release if anything happened to me or my mother. Paranoid? Perhaps. But Sheriff Sheila had already demonstrated her willingness to abuse power for personal vendettas, and as her grip tightened, I could feel the pressure building toward something dangerous. She was used to compliance through intimidation, to silence maintained by fear. But I was not afraid. Not anymore. What she called authority, I called abuse. and now I was gathering the final pieces to expose her completely. The records arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 heavy boxes delivered by a county clerk who avoided eye contact as I signed for them. 5 years of towing records. 5 years of Sheriff Sheila Grayson's selective enforcement, preserved in carbon copies and digital printouts. I carried them into my father's study and began the methodical process of uncovering truth. Hour after hour, I sorted through citation after citation, organized them by date, location, stated violation, cross-referenced them with town events, council meetings, public hearings. A pattern emerged, clear, undeniable, and damning. Sheila had been using her badge not to enforce the law, but to weaponize it against those who challenged her. Vehicles towed from church parking lots during services where the pastor had criticized police budgets. Cars removed from outside the homes of council members who had voted against her department requests. And most disturbing of all, at least 7 instances of vehicles towed during funerals of individuals who had publicly opposed Sheila during their lives. Most telling were the violations themselves. Many cited restricted zones that had never been properly designated. Others referenced ordinances that had been proposed but never actually passed. Some simply contained no violation code at all, just Sheila's signature and the dreaded sheriff's discretionary authority notation. I called Catherine that evening, my voice tight with controlled anger. "This is worse than we thought," I told her. "She has been falsifying enforcement zones, backdating citations, and applying non-existent ordinances." "Those are criminal violations," Catherine replied, the lawyer in her voice taking over. "This goes beyond civil liability or procedural errors. This is misconduct in office." The next day, I met with Amy Sawyer, a reporter for the local newspaper. She had been one of my father's students 15 years earlier and had maintained a correspondence with him over the years. We sat in a quiet corner of a diner 2 towns over, far from Sheila's network of eyes and ears. "I need to see everything," Amy said after I explained the situation. "Every record, every pattern, every piece of evidence you have collected." I slid a thumb drive across the table. "It is all there. 5 years of documented abuses, testimonials from victims, statistical analysis showing the targeting cannot be coincidental." Amy pocketed the drive, her expression serious. "You understand what this means, James. If I run this story, Sheila will know exactly where it came from. She will come after you full force." "She already has," I replied, "but now the whole town will know why." Over the next few days, I compiled my findings into a digital presentation titled "Selective Enforcement in a Grieving Town." 48 slides of evidence, testimony, and irrefutable data. Maps showing clusters of towing incidents around specific events. Charts illustrating the correlation between speaking against Sheila and facing enforcement actions. Photographs of illegitimate "no parking" signs that appeared without proper notification. I created an anonymous email account and shared the presentation with community leaders, business owners, and civic organizations. I included a simple message: "This affects all of us. Share widely. Knowledge is our protection." The response was immediate. The presentation spread through social media, text messages, email chains. People who had remained silent for years began speaking out, adding their own experiences to the growing chorus of voices. Sheriff Sheila responded predictably, with denial and threats. She called a press conference on the steps of the sheriff's department, her uniform pressed and perfect, her expression stern beneath the brim of her hat. "These allegations are categorically false," she declared to the assembled reporters. "This department enforces parking regulations based solely on violations, not on personal vendettas. This is nothing more than a smear campaign by individuals with grudges against law enforcement. A reporter from the regional news station raised his hand. Sheriff Grayson, can you explain why the vehicle of James Mitchell was the only one towed from his father's funeral when several others were parked in the same location? Sheila's composure faltered momentarily. That was a special circumstance. There were safety concerns specific to that vehicle's location. What safety concerns? The reporter pressed. I would have to consult the record, Sheila replied, her voice tightening. I cannot recall the specific details of every enforcement action. But you personally ordered that tow, another voice called out. Witnesses saw you at the scene. The tow driver confirmed you radioed the order directly. Sheila's face flushed. For a moment the mask slipped completely. The Mitchell situation was, look, there are procedures in place. If anyone has a complaint about enforcement actions, there are proper channels. Like the complaint form James Mitchell filed that was never processed. Amy Sawyer stood up, notebook in hand. Or the other 17 complaints filed against your department in the past year that mysteriously disappeared from county records. Sheila's eyes narrowed as she scanned the crowd for the source of this information. When her gaze found mine, standing quietly at the back of the gathered onlookers, something dangerous flickered across her face. This press conference is over, she snapped, turning abruptly and marching back into the building. The assembled crowd did not disperse. Instead, people began talking among themselves, sharing stories, comparing notes. The wall of silence that had protected Sheila for years was crumbling, one voice at a time. That evening, the local news ran a segment titled Sheriff's Towing Practices Under Scrutiny. The regional paper published Amy's investigative piece, Sheriff Sheila's War on the Bereaved. Online forums buzzed with residents sharing their own encounters with selective enforcement. As I watched the coverage from my father's living room, my mother sat beside me, her hand resting gently on mine. Your father would be proud, she said softly. He always believed the truth would find its way to the light. I nodded, thinking of the files in the attic, the evidence he had gathered but never used, the battle he had prepared for but never fought. He started this, I replied. I am just finishing it. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming against the windows. Somewhere across town, I knew Sheila was watching the same news coverage, feeling the ground shifting beneath her feet. The power she had wielded so carelessly was beginning to turn against her, and for the first time since I had returned home, I felt something like hope rising in my chest. This was not just about my father anymore, or even about me. This was about a town reclaiming its voice after years of intimidation. As the news segment ended, my phone began buzzing with messages from strangers, people thanking me, offering their support, sharing their own stories of Sheila's abuses. The mask had finally begun to slip, and behind it, everyone could now see the truth I had discovered in those boxes of records. A sheriff who had forgotten that her badge was meant to protect the people, not to punish them. The town council chamber had not been this full in decades. People stood along the walls, sat on window ledges, crowded the doorway. The emergency session had been called after 3 council members formally requested a review of Sheriff Sheila's enforcement practices. Now, as the council members took their seats at the elevated table, the room hummed with tense anticipation. Mayor Donovan, a man who had navigated small-town politics for nearly 20 years, called the meeting to order with visible discomfort. He had always maintained a careful alliance with Sheila, neither confronting nor constraining her methods. But now, with public outrage mounting and evidence overwhelming, Neutrality was no longer an option. The council has convened this ethics review to address concerns regarding enforcement practices of the sheriff's department, he announced, his voice steady despite the pressure. We will hear testimony from affected citizens and review documentation of alleged misconduct. One by one, people approached the podium. Mrs. Henderson, whose son's car had been towed during her husband's memorial service. Mr. Castillo, whose delivery truck had been impounded after he spoke against the police budget increase. Reverend Williams, whose church parking lot had been targeted during services where he had preached about accountability and leadership. Some spoke with quavering voices, others with quiet dignity, a few with barely contained fury, but all shared the same experience: selective punishment administered by a sheriff who used her authority as a weapon. Most powerful were those who brought evidence. Cell phone videos of Sheila ordering tows while identical violations nearby went unaddressed. Photographs of citation books with dates obviously altered. Audio recordings of deputies admitting they were told to focus on certain troublemakers. Through it all, Sheriff Sheila sat in the front row, arms crossed, expression hardening with each new testimony. When a deputy currently under her command approached the podium, her posture stiffened visibly. I cannot continue to enforce policies that target specific individuals, the young officer stated, avoiding Sheila's glare. It goes against everything I was taught about the badge I wear. When my name was called, a hush fell over the room. Everyone knew my story by now. The son whose grief had been trampled on, who had returned to find his father's legacy under attack. But instead of approaching the podium, I remained seated. Mr. Mitchell has submitted a recorded statement, the council secretary announced. The lights dimmed, and my face appeared on the large screen at the front of the chamber. I had recorded my testimony the previous evening, wanting my words to stand on their own, free from emotion or interruption. I came home to bury my father, my recorded self began. Instead, I uncovered a system of intimidation and retaliation that has held this town hostage for years. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was one example of a pattern that has affected dozens of families, businesses, and individuals. I detailed the evidence methodically: the statistical improbability of the towing patterns, the procedural violations, the falsified records. I explained how my father had begun documenting these abuses before his death, how his work had ultimately led to this moment of reckoning. This is not about parking tickets or towing fees, I concluded. This is about the corruption of authority and the betrayal of public trust. My father taught generations of students about civic responsibility and the rule of law. The greatest dishonor to his memory would be to allow these abuses to continue unchallenged. As the recording ended, Sheila rose abruptly from her seat. Her face was flushed with anger as she strode to the podium without being called. "This is a conspiracy," she declared, her voice ringing through the chamber. "A coordinated attack on law enforcement by individuals with personal grudges and political agendas. I have served this town faithfully for 17 years. These accusations are baseless and—" "We have the records, Sheriff Grayson," Councilwoman Hayes interrupted, her voice firm despite her age. "Your own department's documentation contradicts your statement." "Those records have been manipulated," Sheila insisted, knuckles white against the podium. "James Mitchell has fabricated evidence to smear my reputation because of a personal vendetta." The mayor cleared his throat. "Sheriff Grayson, we have verified the authenticity of these records with county officials. They came directly from your department's files." For a moment, Sheila seemed at a loss for words. Then her expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. "This council has no authority over my department. I answer to the county, not to you." "That is correct," the mayor acknowledged. "However, this council does have the authority to suspend your enforcement jurisdiction within town limits pending a formal investigation. And in light of the evidence presented today, I am calling for a vote on exactly that measure." The vote was unanimous, 7 hands raised in affirmation. For the first time since she had pinned on her badge, Sheila's authority had been checked. "Effective immediately," Mayor Donovan announced, "all parking and traffic enforcement within town limits will be conducted by state patrol officers until this matter is resolved. Sheriff Grayson is hereby restricted from issuing citations or ordering towing actions within our jurisdiction." I watched from my seat as Sheila's face contorted with fury. For years, she had wielded her power unchallenged, secure in the knowledge that no one dared stand against her. Now, in a single afternoon, that power had been stripped away. As she stormed from the chamber, people moved aside, no longer cowering but watching with clear eyes and straight backs. The fear that had gripped the town for so long was beginning to lift. For the first time, the council had awakened to its responsibility, and the town was finally beginning to breathe again. State auditors arrived 3 days after the council meeting. 4 men and women in pressed suits and practical shoes, carrying laptops and document cases. They set up in a conference room at City Hall, their presence a physical manifestation of the scrutiny now focused on Sheriff Sheila Grayson. "We have been authorized to conduct a comprehensive review of all enforcement actions over the past 7 years," the lead auditor explained during a brief press conference. "Our investigation will be thorough, impartial, and transparent." Word spread quickly through town. Interviews were being conducted, records subpoenaed, computer systems examined. Deputies were called in one by one, questioned under oath about departmental practices and specific enforcement actions. The stress began to show immediately within the sheriff's department. Deputies calling in sick, whispered conversations that fell silent when others approached, a nervous energy that permeated the building. On the 4th day, Deputy Carl Watson resigned. By the following morning, another deputy had followed suit. Both immediately agreed to cooperate fully with the state investigation, trading their first-hand knowledge for immunity from potential charges. "She kept separate logs," Carl revealed during his formal interview, a transcript of which was leaked to the local paper. "Official records for inspection, and her private notes of who needed to be reminded of their place. She called it preventive enforcement, targeting people before they caused problems." The investigation expanded beyond towing records. Citations for loitering, disturbing the peace, code violations, all revealed the same pattern of selective enforcement against those who had challenged Sheila's authority or policies. Most damning were the digital forensics. Technicians recovered emails Sheila had attempted to delete, messages instructing deputies to focus on specific individuals or businesses. They found backdated reports, altered citation records, and evidence that complaint forms had been systematically destroyed. One recovered email sent the day before my father's funeral read simply, "Mitchell's service tomorrow. Watch for violations. Priority enforcement requested." The county prosecutor, a serious woman with 20 years of experience, began building a case for official misconduct. "The evidence suggests a pattern of abuse that goes well beyond administrative error," she told reporters. "We are looking at potential criminal charges including abuse of authority, falsification of government records, and official oppression." 7 days into the investigation, state officials arrived at the sheriff's department with search warrants. News cameras captured the moment as they emerged hours later, carrying boxes of files, computers, and Sheila's personal records. The image, uniformed officers removing evidence from a sheriff's department, appeared on the front page of every regional newspaper. Sheila's response was a desperate attempt to maintain control. She held an impromptu press conference, claiming political persecution and a deep state conspiracy against rural law enforcement. But her words rang hollow now, undermined by the mountain of evidence and the steady stream of former allies turning against her. Two more deputies resigned the following day. The county administrator issued a statement distancing the government from Sheila's actions. Former town officials came forward with their own stories of intimidation and threats. The collapse was happening faster than anyone had anticipated. What had been built on fear dissolved quickly once that fear was removed. Like a house of cards in a sudden breeze, Sheila's empire of intimidation was falling apart. I watched it all unfold from a careful distance, declining interview requests and avoiding public statements. This was no longer about me or even my father. It had become something larger, a community reclaiming its dignity and demanding accountability. 10 days after the investigation began, I stood across the street from the sheriff's department, watching as more state officials entered the building. In my hand, I held a framed photograph of my father, not a recent one, but from 30 years earlier when he had first started teaching. His smile was open, his eyes bright with purpose and principle. A deputy exited the building, spotted me, and quickly looked away. The word around town was that Sheila had become erratic, paranoid, lashing out at her remaining staff and blaming everyone but herself for her circumstances. As I stood there, an unmarked car pulled up to the department. Two men in suits emerged and entered the building without a word to the officers stationed outside. 20 minutes later, they reappeared with Sheila between them. Her expression was stone, her posture rigid. She was not in handcuffs, a professional courtesy, but the significance of the moment was unmistakable. She saw me as they guided her to the waiting car. Our eyes met across the distance, and for a brief moment something passed between us, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. She had tried to diminish my father's memory, to assert her power even over his funeral. Now she was being led away while his legacy, embodied in the evidence I had compiled, dismantled everything she had built. The car pulled away, carrying Sheila to what would be the first of many interviews with state prosecutors. I remained standing there, my father's photograph in hand, as a light rain began to fall. People passed by, some nodding in acknowledgement, others stopping briefly to offer a word of thanks or support. Margaret Willis, the former city clerk, approached slowly, umbrella in hand. She believed paperwork was power, Margaret said quietly, looking at the sheriff's department. She buried her enemies in citations and fines, thinking they would never find their way out. But paperwork cuts both ways, I replied. Margaret nodded, opening her umbrella against the increasing rain. Your father would be proud. He always said the truth keeps better records than lies. I looked once more at the photograph in my hand. The man who had taught me about integrity and perseverance. The man whose memory had been disrespected, but whose principles had ultimately prevailed. Sheriff Sheila had tried to bury us with bureaucracy, but now she was buried in her own. The evidence she had created, the records she had manipulated, the power she had abused, all of it had collapsed around her, leaving nothing but the truth exposed to the light. The county courthouse stood at the center of town, its limestone facade weathered by decades of sun and rain. It had witnessed generations of local history, celebrations and tragedies, triumphs and failures. Now it would bear witness to another chapter as Sheriff Sheila Grayson faced justice within its walls. The charges were read in a packed courtroom: official misconduct, abuse of authority, falsification of government records, conspiracy to violate civil rights. Each count spoken with the weight of legal formality, transforming years of petty tyranny into precisely articulated offenses. Sheila stood at the defendant's table in civilian clothes. No uniform, no badge, no visible symbol of the authority she had wielded so carelessly. Her attorney entered a plea of not guilty, his voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. I sat near the back, a silent observer to the proceedings. This was not personal gratification I sought, only accountability. The wheels of justice would turn now without my pushing. The evidence would speak for itself. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered with cameras and microphones, documenting the fall of a woman who had once seemed untouchable. The story had spread beyond our small town, capturing attention across the state as an example of grassroots resistance against corrupt authority. 2 weeks later, the town council convened for their regular meeting. The agenda included an item titled Recognition and Remembrance, Thomas Mitchell Memorial Proposal. I sat beside my mother as Councilwoman Hayes presented the motion. Thomas Mitchell served this community for 37 years as an educator, coach, and civic leader, she began. His commitment to teaching young people about responsibility, ethics, and community service shaped generations of citizens. In recognition of his contributions, this council proposes that the town recreation field be renamed Coach Mitchell Memorial Park, with an appropriate plaque commemorating his legacy. The vote was unanimous. My mother's hand tightened around mine as applause filled the chamber. It was not grand or monumental, just a simple recognition of a man who had given his life to his community, who had taught his students that character mattered more than power. In the days that followed, I gathered the entire case file, every document, photograph, testimony, and analysis, and donated it to a nonprofit organization that supported rural communities facing similar abuses of power. Perhaps somewhere, another town was suffering under its own version of Sheriff Sheila. Perhaps my father's legacy could help them find their voice. We will use this as a template, the organization's director assured me, a roadmap for communities to hold their officials accountable. The aftermath of Sheila's removal brought other changes to town. The newly appointed interim sheriff instituted new protocols for enforcement actions. The county began reviewing all citations and towing incidents from the past decade. Letters of apology were sent to those who had been wrongfully targeted, along with refunds for fines and fees. Mr. Henderson was the first to receive his refund, compensation for the car towed during his wife's funeral service. He found me one afternoon as I was leaving the grocery store. "You fixed it," he said simply, emotion making his voice rough. "All these years we just took it. We complained among ourselves but never did anything. You fixed what was broken." "I did not fix it," I corrected him gently. "The truth fixed it. I just refused to let it stay buried." The most unexpected development came 3 weeks after Sheila's arraignment. The mayor approached me after a community meeting, asking if I would consider serving as a consultant for the town's new government transparency initiative. "We need someone who understands the importance of proper documentation and ethical enforcement," he explained. "Someone who can help us rebuild trust with the community." I considered the offer carefully. My life and career were elsewhere, but there was something appealing about helping to establish safeguards against future abuses, about transforming my father's passive documentation into active protection. "I can consult remotely," I offered, help establish protocols and review systems. The mayor nodded, relief evident in his expression. That would be tremendously valuable. The council is committed to making sure nothing like this happens again. That evening, I walked through town as the sun set, casting long shadows across familiar streets. The hardware store where Mr. Hernandez was arranging his sidewalk display without fear of sudden fines. The flower shop where Elaine had returned her arrangements to their traditional spots. The church where my father's funeral had been held, now preparing for a wedding. Small changes, perhaps invisible to outsiders. But to those who had lived under Sheila's shadow, they represented a profound shift, from fear to freedom, from oppression to openness. I passed the sheriff's department, now operating under temporary leadership while a proper selection process was established. The building looked the same, brick and glass and official seals, but the power it represented had been transformed, not diminished, but redirected toward its intended purpose, protection rather than persecution. Justice had not come with dramatic confrontations or violent upheaval. It had arrived quietly, in the form of documented evidence and legal procedure, in careful investigations and formal charges, in the steady application of law rather than its perversion. As I walked back to my mother's house in the gathering dusk, I thought about how my father would have appreciated this outcome. Not a victory won through force or intimidation, the tactics Sheila had employed, but through persistence, documentation, and truth. Through the patient accumulation of evidence that could not be denied. Justice, written in ink on court documents and carved in stone on a memorial plaque. Not revenge or retribution, but restoration. The return of a community to its proper balance. The redirection of authority to its proper purpose. In the end, Sheila had not been defeated by a greater power, but by the proper use of power itself. By the very systems she had abused, now functioning as they were designed to function. And in that, there was a poetry that even the most eloquent revenge could never match. The morning of my departure dawned clear and cool, a perfect spring day in the town where I had grown up. 3 weeks had passed since Sheila's arraignment, 6 since the investigation began, 7 since I had stood in my funeral suit watching my car being towed away from my father's service. A lifetime of change compressed into less than 2 months. I packed unhurriedly, folding clothes and gathering belongings with deliberate care. My mother moved around the house with a lighter step these days. Her grief remained. A husband of 45 years cannot be replaced, but the weight of injustice no longer compounded her loss. "Will you visit more often now?" she asked as she helped me sort through the last of my father's papers I had been organizing. "Yes," I promised, "and not just for holidays or emergencies." She smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way it had not since before my father's death. "This town feels like home again," she said simply. Before loading my car, I took one last drive through Millfield. The route was deliberately chosen, past the places that had featured in this unexpected chapter of my life. The impound lot where I had discovered the truth behind Sheila's actions. The courthouse where justice was now taking its course. The sheriff's department, operating under new leadership with new principles. I stopped at the newly renamed Coach Mitchell Memorial Park. The sign had been installed just days earlier, simple, dignified lettering on a wooden board. Beneath it, a bronze plaque bore my father's likeness and a brief summary of his contributions to the community. Children played on the baseball diamond where he had coached for decades. Their shouts and laughter carried across the spring air, uninhibited and free. A woman approached as I stood there, Mrs. Torres, who had taught alongside my father for 20 years. "He would have hated the fuss," she said with a fond smile, gesturing toward the sign. But he would have loved seeing the kids play without looking over their shoulders. Without fear, I agreed. That was his gift, she continued, creating spaces where people could be their best selves, where rules existed to protect, not control. She paused, looking at me directly. You are very much his son. My final stop was at the town records office, where I had one last task to complete. Jessica, the clerk who had helped me access Sheila's towing records, greeted me with a warm smile. Finalizing everything, she asked. Just one more document to file, I replied, placing a sealed envelope on the counter. For the permanent record. Inside was a complete summary of what had happened, from my father's funeral to Sheila's arraignment. Not my personal feelings or interpretations, but a factual account with references to all relevant documents and testimony. A roadmap for anyone who might need to understand this chapter of town history in the future. I will make sure it goes into the official archive, Jessica promised. Some stories need to be remembered. As I drove out of town, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the familiar landscape receding behind me. I was leaving, but not running away. Not this time. I would return for Sheila's trial, for the official dedication of the park, for holidays with my mother. This place was part of me again, not just a childhood memory or a source of grief, but a community I had helped to heal. In my briefcase was a single memento I had decided to keep, one of the original toe slips from my father's funeral, preserved in a simple frame. Not as a trophy of victory or a symbol of grievance, but as a reminder of what happens when silence is broken, when complacency gives way to courage, when documentation becomes determination. I would place it on my office wall, not prominently displayed but quietly present, not to relive the anger or humiliation of that moment, but to remember the importance of standing against injustice, regardless of its scale. My father had taught generations of students that society functions only when good people hold power accountable. He had documented Sheila's abuses but held back from confrontation, perhaps believing that systems would eventually correct themselves. In the end, it had taken both approaches, his patient documentation and my direct challenge, to bring about change. I thought about what he might say if he could see how things had unfolded, how his quiet collection of evidence had ultimately formed the foundation for justice, how his legacy now extended beyond the classroom into the very governance of the town he had served. The highway stretched before me, leading back to my own life and work. But something had shifted within me during these weeks. Something my father had always tried to teach me, that standing for what is right is never wasted effort, even when the results are not immediately visible. Sheila had tried to dishonor my father's legacy with one final act of petty vengeance. Instead, she had inadvertently strengthened it, creating circumstances that allowed his principles to reshape the community he had loved. As the town disappeared from my rearview mirror, I smiled, feeling a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with restoration. My father would have understood. More than that, I think he would have smiled too. Because in the end, Sheila had not just taken my car or trampled my grief. She had challenged a legacy built on integrity and service. And in doing so, she had not diminished it. She had helped me build it into something even stronger.